the first lesson here, this lesson is the Apostolic Succession, and that's a term that probably nobody, well, not nobody, very few people in Protestantism understand what that means. It's not at all important to Protestants, but it's really, really important to the Catholic Church. And so we'll talk about that a little bit because it goes back in history and it continues on in our time. And so, what is apostolic succession? It's the idea that something of value was passed from the original apostles to the leaders of the churches. And so, those apostles all started churches. We know about Paul and the ones that he started in particular. But a lot of them did that. John did that, and others were all starting churches wherever they went. And so the idea behind apostolic succession is when they started a church and they set up somebody as being the leader of that church, something of value was passed on to the leader of that church. And it was something that would be passed on to the leaders that came after that leader of the church. So it creates a succession that they believe has something of value in that succession. And I'll dig into that a little bit more later. But looking at it from the other direction, from the other point of view, you can say that the idea is that there is some value in the lineage of a church. So there's some value in knowing that a church can be traced back to one of the original apostles. And as I said, this wasn't an idea that was any part of the early churches, although the early churches could actually say, this is the apostle who started our church. He came here and he taught our people, and he started this church that we are now part of. And so the early churches could do that. But it wasn't important to them, but it was really, really important to the Catholic Church, and it became that way when the Catholic Church, well, it was just the Church of Rome at that time, but the Church of Rome wanted to be the church of all churches. They wanted to be the leader of the entire of all of Christianity, and so as part of that, it was using this claim that Peter was the one who had set up their church, had created their church, and that everybody in the Church of Rome had been the people in that lineage down from Peter, and so the only people who accept this idea of apostolic succession is the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches, and the Orthodox churches are included in that because they split off from the Roman Catholic Church after the Roman Catholic Church had adopted that idea of apostolic succession. And so they still accept it, but nobody in Protestantism, nobody in Egyptian, none of the other churches accept that idea, despite the fact that they all could, and some still do, identify who the apostle was that started their churches. And so we know that the apostles passed valuable teachings to the churches. We see it in the epistles that Paul wrote. He was teaching them all about Christianity, what it means to be a Christian and live that life and all of those things. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something that's different, something that's more ethereal than that. And when you really get down to it, apostolic succession is about the succession of leaders of the churches. And more than that, it's really about the right to rule. And that's what the Catholic Church wanted to get out of that. They were trying to establish that they came from Peter, and they had this idea that Peter was the leader of all of the apostles, and so because he is the leader of the apostles, they should be the leader of all the other churches. And so it was all part of their power move to become the head of all of Christianity, which is what they wanted to be. And from their point of view, they were Romans in a Roman world, and they thought that therefore that the Church of Rome should be the church that was over all of the other churches in the Roman Empire. So that's kind of where it comes from and why it was important to the Roman Catholic Church. But it's not important to anybody in the Protestant movement, and lots of other people disagree with that too. And so you have to ask, why was it started and why does it persist? And I've talked about that a little bit so far already. It was really a big part of a power move that they were doing. And you can see why it was started because of what it achieves. And so what does it achieve? It makes a spiritual church like an earthly kingdom. And so you can become a king of this kingdom in a physical sense. And so it creates something that is much like the world's kingdoms out of what was supposed to have been a spiritual church. And with that, it creates a continuing priesthood that is like a continuing kingship. And so you get some continuity from that, from that idea of succession, and you also get an earthly kingdom, and that's what the Romans really wanted. They loved earthly kingdoms, and so it also centralizes the authority in the hands of men. So So the people who are going to be the successors of the current leader of the church are going to be selected by men, and they pass that down. And so politics can become very involved in that, and it did many times. Back in medieval times, there were people who were buying popeships, and so by paying a certain amount of money, they managed to make themselves into a pope. And so by centralizing authority, it made the target or made the leadership of Christianity a target for people who wanted to have that claim that they were the head of all of Christianity. And another thing that it does, yeah, go ahead.
Excuse me, Stan.
Yeah.
I was going to say that maybe you're going to talk about it in a bit. I don't know. But a lot of Catholics say that Peter was the first pope.
Mm-hmm.
And based on that, you got to listen to whatever they say because it's coming from the first one.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I've had discussions with Catholics about theology, and every time I do that, it comes back not just to Peter, but to this chair. And this chair that Peter is said to have sat in when he was the person who was the first pope. And they still have that chair. They claim to it. They don't let hardly anybody ever see it. Very few people have seen this chair. And the people who've seen it say that it looks more like a medieval chair. It doesn't look like something that would have been created back in that long ago. And so it's probably a fraud as well. And there isn't any reason to believe that Peter ever was in Rome. He wasn't a person who could have spoken Latin or Greek, and so why would he have even gone there? And he wasn't the person that God had sent to do that kind of outreach into the Greek and Roman world. So and so the third thing that you achieve by setting up this succession is it protects against other claims to authority. So once you're the Pope and you've been made the Pope by the hands of men, then nobody else can challenge that. You are the Pope. Now you'd think that that always worked, but in fact it didn't always work that well. There was a period of time in the Catholic Church when there were three popes who were all fighting over who was the Pope in charge. And so it didn't always work that way, but you do get a certain amount of that when you have this successionism plan, the same as kingdoms. And so the why behind all of it is power, and it was really all about power politics. And people like to be king. It's good to be king. You get a whole bunch of advantages from being king. And there even people in the church had this idea that they wanted to be king too. Now, another thing was pointed out to me that I also knew before this trip, and there's something of false humility in this. In the papal residence that's at the Vatican in Rome, there, not this pope, but a few popes back, the pope decided that he wasn't going to stay in the papal apartments. There's a papal apartment that is set up for the pope to stay in while he's pope, and and uh, and that had been the official residence since the 17th century of the Pope. And what happened a few popes back, I don't remember which one it was, he decided that these papal apartments were way too lavish for him, and he was just going to stay in the guest room instead, and he wasn't going to enjoy all of the spacious immenseness that was available to him in the papal apartments. And our tour guide, when she talked about this, she said, "Oh, our Pope is so wonderful because he has decided that he's only going to stay in the guest room. He's not going to stay in the papal apartments. Isn't he a humble man because of that?" Well, no, it's a false humility. Um, the papal apartments aren't available to anybody else. They're just not being used. And so what he's really doing is he's living in all of them. He's living in the papal apartments because nobody else can live in there, and he's living in the guest room as well. And so there's a real false humility involved in that. You're not being humble when you keep something allocated to yourself, but you don't use it. Nonetheless, that's part of the Catholicism that I kept bumping into there. So in our time, no one lives in the papal apartments, and no one is allowed to live in the papal apartments. They're still dedicated to the Pope, but the Pope has decided he's going to live in what were supposed to be the guest quarters for visitors. So this kind of stuff goes on all the time in Roman Catholic Church. And so how does this succession work, this Pope succession? And we've had a number of popes who've come in our lifetimes, and so a lot of us have seen this process going on. So most of this is just going to be a remembrance. And so a pope serves until he dies. Pretty much that's the way. There's only been a few times when that wasn't the way, and I'll talk about that in a second. So when a pope dies, a subset of the cardinals, who are called the cardinal electors, which are the people who can do the voting, and this group of people are set in motion, and they select a new pope by voting, and they put out the names of different people and they vote on that, and they keep doing this process until they get to a certain number of popes in favor of one of the people who has thrown his name in the ring. And so after they've selected this pope and after he accepts, he cannot be removed from that position. The only way to get him out is to convince him to abdicate. And that has happened. There have been some popes who were so bad that when the people kind of rose up, when the cardinals rose up against them and said, look, what you're doing here, you're not living a biblical life at all. And they finally decided to leave. But there were other really bad popes who didn't leave, and they died in that chair despite living a life that was nothing like a Christian life. So once the cardinals choose this pope and he accepts, he cannot be removed. He can only leave on his own will. So
and of course, remember that even the election to succeed him is rigged, because the Pope chooses the cardinals, and they're the ones that vote. So, like, for example, this Pope that we have is maybe the most liberal Pope ever. Mm-hmm. He has just been packing cardinals with people that think just like him. I mean, he's appointed tens of them over his papacy. So, of course, when he dies, he's going to assure that his successor is liberal just like him, because he's kind of packed the ballot box. So, yeah. So it's kind of silly.
Yeah, absolutely true. He has been doing that. And I've followed for a long time a group of people who were very upset about his liberalism and how he was trying to change the church. And they made every effort they could to try to convince him to get out, and that he wasn't the right person. And they found that they had no power. There is no one who has any sort of power to make him do anything. And so he continues on doing what he's doing. And so, yeah, continuing on with, is this a biblical idea at all? And as I said before, the Catholic Church believes that Peter was made the leader of the apostles. There's nothing to evidence that. But they have a verse here, and we'll talk about that verse in just a moment. And so they believe that their church was started by Peter, but that doesn't make any sense either. There's no evidence that Peter ever went there, and he wouldn't have had any reason to go to Rome. So nonetheless, they claim that the Roman Catholic Church is descended from Peter. He was the greatest of the apostles, and they are the greatest of the churches. And that belief comes from these verses here. And so this is from Matthew 16:18 through 19. Jesus is speaking, and he says, I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So they see that as Jesus talking to Peter, saying that Peter is going to be the foundation of the church. And since he was the one who started their church, they claim, then their church continues on that succession, that apostolic succession, and they are still the church that Jesus was talking about. But there's a real problem in the translation here, and the NIV translation is as bad as any other translations here. They are being very, very careful not to offend Catholics by translating this the way it should be. And so we're going to look at that for just a moment here. But the first thing you can see that shows you there is a problem in the translation comes in here. It says, this is Jesus speaking to Peter, and he says, I tell you that you are Peter. Well, why is Jesus telling Peter that his name is Peter? Peter knows that already because Jesus gave him that name much earlier than this. And so why is he doing that? Well, that's not what he's doing. The name Peter means rock. So just as some of our names, like my name Stan means stone, and that's where that comes from. So a lot of our names also have meanings behind them. And so it's the same way with the name Peter. Peter means rock. But it's not just any rock. It's a rock that is more or less round and bigger than a pebble, but not as big as a boulder. And so it's kind of a hand-sized rock. And now the other word that you see that was translated as rock, that's one down here. Let me get my pointer out. This one here is a completely different word. It is not the word Peter. It is a different word here, and it's referring to a different kind of rock. It's referring to something that we would call a rock shelf. We don't have a single word for it, but it's a huge flat rock on which you could build a building. It's that big that you could build a building on it. And remember that that's how buildings were built back then. You wanted to find a good, solid rock on which to build things, because that would mean that if there's an earthquake or whatever, your building wouldn't fall down. And we saw lots of that on our trip, is huge swaths of rock that had been turned into buildings because they built a building on top of it. So what that verse said when I read it to you at first says, I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. But a better translation of that would be, I tell you that you are a rock. He's saying this to Peter, and on this rock shelf I will build my church. So Jesus is plainly talking about two different things. He's saying, Peter, you're a rock, but I'm going to build my church on a rock shelf. So he's talking about something bigger than Peter. But it's not really clear exactly what he's talking about here. But there's other verses that talk about this same, what is the foundation of the church idea? And this one comes from Ephesians. And so it says, therefore, you are not strangers, neither guests, but inhabitants of the city of the Holy One and children of the household of God. And you are built up upon the foundation of the apostles and of the prophets. And he, Jesus, is the head of the corner of the building, Yeshua the Messiah. So what Ephesians is really saying is that all of this has been built up. The cornerstone for it is Jesus, and it's built on the apostles and the prophets. That would be the Old Testament prophets. And in Revelation, we see the same thing. The city of God that descends down to earth is said to have been built on the prophets and the apostles as well. So we see that idea that is the rock shelf that Jesus was talking about, all of the apostles and the prophets, and Jesus, of course, being the cornerstone for all of it. And that makes sense to us. It doesn't make sense that one apostle would be the person on which the entire church is built. But that's what the Roman Catholic Church has done here. They've used this idea that Peter was the head of the apostles, and therefore they are the head of the churches. So um, continuing with this question of, is it a biblical idea, this whole apostolic succession idea? And so Paul talks about how to organize a church. He says that to Timothy and to Titus, and especially in Timothy, he spends a lot of time talking about the different positions in the church and what they should do. And he talks about accountability of these people, and he talks about who's the right people to put into these positions. But he doesn't make any mention of an organizational level above the local church. And so there's no denominational idea that we see there. We don't see any church that is the leader of churches. And nothing in the Bible ever mentions that idea. And what he does say, though, to Timothy is, he says each church should choose the people and remove, if necessary, its own leaders, because sometimes people fall away and make mistakes, and they shouldn't be in leadership position anymore. And Paul talks about exactly that kind of situation, and he talks about it as being something that would be dealt with at the local church level. And so Paul's model for the leaders is also very different from the Catholic Church model. The Catholic Church model is a king leadership model. So once you're king, you can do whatever you want and nobody can dethrone you. But Paul's model for the leaders that he talks about is about servant leadership. A person who leads by being the servant of others. He helps others do better by being the assistant to them, to be the helper of them. He's not the king commanding down to them. He's the person who's the servant lifting them up. And so the whole leadership idea in the Catholic Church is not what Paul talks about when he talks about churches and how to build churches. And Paul himself is a servant leader in everything that he's done. You can see that he sacrifices himself to make others better. And we don't see him being ever a king who demands that people do things and he's somehow unaccountable to them. So what we just don't see in the Bible is anything about this apostolic succession idea. It appears to have been made up by the Roman Catholic Church to suit their own needs, and there's just nothing in the Bible that is like that in any way. So that's all I wanted to say there. Do you have any questions about that?
Hey Stan, not a question, but more like just a comment. So, and in the Catholic's little book, right, there's like a prayer that you have to say on every Sunday, right? It's pretty much, and it's talking about that we believe in this and that, and we believe in one holy apostolic church, and there's some other pardon, I don't remember anymore, but it's like a ritual.
Yep.
You know, it's a pagan ritual that everybody has to say that every Sunday when they meet.
Yeah.
First thing.
And
It's
also
crazy.
it's also indoctrination. If the ideas you're trying to sell aren't in the Bible, you need another way to sell them to the people. And so by having the
Yeah.
people read this, you are teaching them your doctrine.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.